So when were the Gospels written? It might not be what you expect, but we get into that in this episode of the Accessible Faith Project. Hi there, I'm John, and welcome to the Accessible Faith Project. If you're new here and looking for insights into the Bible, faith, and history in ways that engage your brain regardless of your faith stance, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. In an earlier video, I shared a little bit about the earliest Christian writings that we have, with a few that are now part of the New Testament, and one that isn't, but still gives us a real insight into the development of the early church. As I mentioned in that video, the Gospel of Matthew wasn't written first, and Revelation was not written last. There are all kinds of reasons why we now know that, and scholars have developed their entire careers around this. The four Gospels hold a unique place within the New Testament because they tell the story and experience of Jesus. In fact, in ancient literature, the term Gospel is used to describe any document that shares the stories or sayings of Jesus. In all, there are at least 20 of these ancient documents of varying quality that can be described as a gospel. However, at least for this video, I'm going to be dealing with the four Gospels in the New Testament, but if you stick around, I'll fill you in on one that isn't. Now, it is natural to assume that these works came first because they are at the beginning of the New Testament, and they provide an encounter with a central figure in the Christian faith. These range from the teachings of Jesus, stories of Jesus, and what has now become known as the Passion Story, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But they weren't written first. While the sayings and stories of Jesus were repeated and shared by the earliest followers of Jesus, remember that the vast majority of them were not able to read or write. Even those described as disciples came from professions who would have never have been trained in that skill set. But as the movement grew, people who could read or write became part of the fold. Paul was one of a small group of literate followers, but there were others. And as the earliest followers began to die off, combined with all the conflicts that were happening around them, there was now an urgent need to assemble these stories and sayings. It was in this setting that the first of the Gospels came together. But which one was written first? In the New Testament, the traditional order we have become used to has been Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That order, for many years, has simply assumed to have been from oldest to newest. But as we have learned from many other places in the Bible, books are arranged for different reasons, and most commonly it's by size or by type. The Gospels in the New Testament are clustered together because of type, although some early collections it was by their size. People like St. Augustine have come up with symbolic reasons for their current order, but in truth, we don't have a definitive reason. It wouldn't be until the 18th century when scholars took a more in-depth look at the Gospels and started recognizing patterns that gave them clues as to what was written first. And while this is worth several videos to get into the why, a consensus began to emerge that the Gospel of Mark, not Matthew, was the earliest of the New Testament Gospels, and that the writers of both Matthew and Luke had a manuscript of Mark in front of them. But they also had more stuff to add. But that in itself is worth several more videos. So if the Gospel of Mark was written first, well, when was it written? While we cannot nail down an absolute fixed date, there's at least a range that we can put it in. There are a few clues to consider. Scholars know for various reasons that it could not have been written any later than 80 CE because it was then being used and quoted in other sources, including the Gospel of Matthew. But on the other end, some clues are a little bit more concrete. Having followers of Jesus who were able to read and write is one factor. The Gospel of Mark was written after Paul's ministry and after the establishment of churches in Asia Minor because it is written in Greek, specifically for Greek-speaking Christian communities. But some major regional events also had a powerful influence, namely the First Jewish-Roman War. The trauma of that event, including a terrible amount of civil strife and Rome's brutal response, created the need for a written gospel. Fledgling Christian communities tried to avoid getting caught in the crossfire by fleeing and taking their stories with them. And the echoes of this conflict can be found in the 13th chapter of Mark, as well as a few other places throughout the Gospel. And given this, and knowing that the First Jewish-Roman War began in 66 CE, and that the temple was destroyed in 70, the Gospel of Mark, the first of the written Gospels of the New Testament, would have been written sometime between 66 and 80 CE, but most likely was between 70 and 75. And while this may seem like a long time between the crucifixion of Jesus and the writing of the first Gospels, keep in mind that the Gospel of Mark is the first written Gospel that we have. For various reasons, scholars have suggested that the writer of the Gospel of Mark was drawing on bits and pieces of older written traditions and oral material and assembled them to tell a cohesive story of Jesus. The timeline of when the Gospels were written is a complex one and needs more than one video, but at least this is a start. The first of the New Testament Gospels is the Gospel of Mark, and it was written most likely between 66 and 75 CE. Now, I did tease about the earliest gospel that isn't in the New Testament, but it has a fairly complex history of its own. Some of you may have heard of something called the Gospel of Thomas. Again, similar to the Didache that I mentioned in the previous video, the Gospel of Thomas was a rediscovery that has helped shed new light on early Christian writings. And while fragments from the Gospel of Thomas have been known for years, a complete copy was found in 1945 at an archaeological site in Egypt. And while this version likely dates from the middle of the 2nd century, there are elements of it that could well be about 100 years earlier than that, placing pieces of the puzzle into the very early Christian communities. However, you're going to have to wait for another video to get the story on that. So in light of this, what questions does it raise? Was any of this new? Let me know in the comments section below. So if you want to explore this in ways that expand your horizons and deepen your understanding regardless of your faith stance, then come and join us on this journey by clicking on subscribe and that little bell icon, and you're all set to go. And I'll see you next time on the Accessible Faith Project.